So to conclude on our analysis of the genesis of the Elven Fairie, wrap up this kind of preliminaries, we were talking about Adam and Eve and our traditional concept of the genesis of civilization, the races, etc. Now, possessing a more clearer, pure genetic material extending back to the source of experiments than the rest of the folk that later emerged in the Old Testament, Adam obviously lived the longest lifespan recorded in that journal, and this kind of begins this idea that elves live a really long time. Lifespans grew increasingly shorter as the generations continued. The more pure strains of genetics from the blue-white race that were found in Adam and Eve were specifically selected for the experiments, and the right of kinship and kingship that came down later gets passed on Abraham and whatnot in that tradition. Now, the bond that, as far as what the Elven tradition holds, the Adaphic tradition specifically, there are lots of races of Fairie. The Adaphic tradition holds that the magical connection is very strong. It holds that sexuality is sacred. So outside the walls of Eden, where things are not so sacred, outside this controlled experiment of Eden, the people were beginning to get jealous about this supremacy that was taking place within also. In one version of the accounts, it was, in her naivety, that Eve shares herself with a man from the other races, he explains to her that it would help to spread the goodness and power to the chaotic, primitive people beyond. But she, in that version, she had already been warned of this, not to mix these polarities, so to speak. And the very moment that Fairie mixed with human, that is kind of that fall that we speak of when Adam and Eve essentially became mortal. And the energy, the personal energy within Eve in that respect would have been affected, and then when Adam shared with her later, then his energy then in turn becomes affected. And this resulted in this kind of loss of grace, as well as the birth of a new generation of Eve's offsprings that were quarter breeds in regards also to sexual morality. The Elven philosophy speaks of the dangers concerning idle sex, meaning derogatory or perversion, lust, things that the modern world of man has more or less come to thrive on. And then, again, going back to the Adaphic Genesis, Cain was not the son of Adam. Cano, and sometimes listed as Enki, the serpent in the garden, was responsible for that change and the jealousy between half-brothers, as Adam would have clearly had favoritism towards his own personal blood son Abel. And this is, again, one version. In the Sumerian version, in the Sumerian version, the big difference comes between the Enlil and Enki, where Enlil is originally put in charge as master of the command on the planet, and is very wary of the creation of this new race, as far as to give it the power of the gods, to give it the power of knowledge. And on his return, when he finds that Enki has imbued the knowledge of the gods, shared the power of the gods with this new generation, and has showed favoritism for them, he becomes angry. And Enki and Enlil become confused in our kind of more Judeo-Christian version of Genesis as one deity. For the sake of monotheism, we lose a lot of that. So, even in the Judeo-Christian lore, however, we confirm the existence of two distinct races. There's that one genetic bloodline mentioned in passing as Watchers and Nephilim, including the Adamic elves, or the sons of God or children of God, as opposed to the children of men. And the terms sons and children are oftentimes used interchangeably. And these ideas are mentioned again only in passing in the Christian traditions and then are mostly dismissed. To the elves, though, the Eru or Anu is that heavenly source of all being almost, and we see that filtered down. However, in the Judeo-Christian, the root Hebrew tradition of it, we find that there are countless, almost, intermediary spirits and hierarchies of spirits between our world and what is considered God, that have a lot to say concerning what takes place in the dimensions and creation and whatnot. So, to consider that the sons of men are descended from the diversity outside of the Eden experiments, as well as the Nodites and whatnot, and were separate from the sons of God. It is mentioned about this even in the traditional Holy Bible. In the Elvish tradition, the sons of man become sons of Mil, the Milesians. And the Milesians were actually the reason that the Elven Ffayrie would later be driven to the forests and the hills and the other world and all of that. So in the end, it seems that Genesis 3:15 is right, and men and elves just do not get along.